today I have another treat for you. Last time we listened to the Reiner version of Scheherazade, and now we will listen to the Monteux version of Scheherazade. And there's also a difference in the pressing between them, because the pressing that we listened to last time for the Reiner version, that was an RCA white dog. So it was a little bit like a later reissue, basically, early reissue, and the middle late pressing. And this one will be a shaded dog, so this is like a first pressing. But out of that, it's the, I wrote it down here, 10SA2I. That's it in the dead wax, so it is the 10th lacquer and second stamper, and made in the Indiana plant. So RCA made records in 3 plants in the US. The Indianapolis plant made the best pressings. So the difference between these different plants is so huge that basically I noticed that if it's not made in the Indiana plant, then it's much worse quality, because they had different engineers, different mastering, different people who did the masters at each plant, and the guys who worked at the Indiana plant, they did much superior job, to such a degree that if you have a 10th lacquer from the Indiana plant and the first lacquer that's like a first pressing from the Hollywood plant, the Indiana mid to late pressing will sound better than the first pressing Hollywood. And I have run into this several times. So if you see like a letter I in the dead wax, that's a really good sign. So don't be dispirited that it's not a first issue, I mean a first pressing or an early, even if it's around like a mid levels, like 9 to 14, 15, it's still pretty good sounding. Of course it has much less detail level, as if it was a first or second pressing. Usually first and second pressings have way more detail level than like a third, fourth pressing. And then if you go to a sixth pressing, then you can see like quite a big gap between that and the first pressing. Between the 6th and the 10th, there's also a little bit of worsening of the details and the sound getting a little bit mushy, but usually 10th lacquer RCAs are still pretty good. And when you climb to 20th, then you are like the 20th lacquer. Then you are going to run into issues, and 30th, 40th, that's usually pretty terrible. There's barely any music on there, and if you have like a 30th lacquer, when you compare it to the first lacquer, it sounds like 2 completely different performances. I have done that several times, like comparing 2 records, like the same record but very different lacquers. And it just shocked me that if I did not see that those have the same writing on the cover, that is the same performance, I would have sworn that those are different performances on the record. So that's why when you listen to records, especially for example you listen to violin performances, then you might misjudge the performer quite a bit, because if you have a later pressing like a 40th lacquer, and Heifetz was pretty popular, so he made tons of records. Toscanini is the worst. So if you find Toscaninis, then you can, I found like a 60th lacquer with his music, and that's absolutely terrible. There's barely anything on it, and when you hear, when people transfer that to digital and it sounds like CRAP, then that's why people make that judgment that early records sounded really terrible, because look at that, we digitize it and it's nothing. Of course it's nothing because you digitize the late pressing. So this is something to know about vinyl, that the earlier the pressing, the more detail it contains, and the better the detail level resolution, and more it sounds like a master tape. If you have a first pressing, then you will be really hard pressed to find a reel-to-reel machine playing the master tape if that can catch up with your first pressing, if you have a really good phono stage. So if you have an excellent phono stage and excellent cartridge, then you will have just about the same experience as listening to the master tape. And that's because most of the reel-to-reel machines, the playback electronics in there is not as good as a really high-end phono stage's electronics. So after that very long introduction, let us see Scheherazade from Pierre Monteux. And just FYI, Harry Pearson called the Reiner version as the best ever recorded classical orchestral piece. And I have already listened to both of them, and I can tell you that actually the Monteux version is even more dynamic and sounds better than that. Of course, this I cannot say that the Monteux version is better, because in my comparison I compared the first pressings 10th lacquer with the reissue, and that's, I think that was also like a 10th lacquer. So let's see now how much an earlier pressing, how much difference that makes when we have an earlier pressing of an inferior recording compared to what we heard the previous time.